Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation, which broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Wayne Haynes, Global Lead and Course Director for Financial Crime Prevention here at ICA, and coming up, we're going to consider the nature, importance and value of blockchain investigations. How following activity on the chain can expose criminality, support due diligence, and strengthen the wider fight against financial crime. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Bogdan Vacusta. Bogdan is the chair of Blockchain Intelligence Professionals Association, the body representing and setting standards for professionals working in this fast developing world. And as ever, we would love to hear from you. Your questions, challenges, observations, these can be made in the comments on your LinkedIn link. So hello to Bogdan.
Thank you for the introduction, Wayne. It's great to be today and discuss about this challenging topic. It's a privilege to share my expertise and my journey with the professionals in the compliance space. Since I had my first ICA diploma in financial crime prevention in 2015, I actually discovered some great initiatives to develop my expertise in this domain. And it's good to also share with the audience that having training with ICA has actually allowed me to understand better the implications from a financial crime perspective. Thanks.
No, thank you, Bogdan, and it's good to hear that because that's one of the main reasons why ICA exists, to give people that confidence. And thank you very much for your time for today's session. So let's talk about some of the myths that surround blockchain. The popular perception is that blockchain offers anonymity to criminals. How accurate is that myth? And what does traceability really mean in practice on a public ledger?
It's actually one of the most stubborn myths in this field, if I could call it stubborn, and we actually need to clarify it. Public blockchain is by design the opposite of being anonymous. Every transaction is actually recorded, timestamped, and of course visible to anyone. And once it is recorded, it cannot be changed or deleted. In fact, we actually have pseudonymity, not anonymity. These addresses are in fact strings of characters, but the activity around them is permanent and easy to investigate once you have the right skills. Traceability, if we discuss in practice, has actually, let's say, 3 layers. The first one is the chain itself. That actually means the raw movement of value, which is in fact open data. Let's call the second as being clustering. This is sometimes a fancy word, not being explained enough, but it actually means to group some addresses that, based on some observed behavior, appear to belong to the same wallet, or let's call it operator. And we go, let's say, to the third one, which is attribution. This actually means linking that cluster to a real-world entity. That could actually mean an exchange, a service, a known threat actor, and ultimately an individual. If we also cover the compliance part, which is actually our main focus, for the compliance professionals, they need to understand that traceability is not the same as a confirmed identity. What the chain actually gives us is just flows. The attribution that I explained earlier gives those flows a meaning. What we have today is attribution actually depending heavily on commercial analytics providers. And there are a lot providing these services, and they use their own labeled datasets. What we actually obtain is that for the same wallet and the same case, these providers can give us different attributions and different risk scores. And this is highly relevant for financial institutions as we have the risk-based approach as the priority.
Mm.
We actually have the data as being public. The challenge is that the interpretation of data hasn't been yet standardized, and this is where our work is actually focused. We actually have the criminals not being invisible, and the methodology used by investigators is actually opaque. And this is exactly the gap that we're trying to close, the standard work, so that we can actually advance the work and make it beneficial for professionals who are not only in the compliance sector, but also in the investigation and the prosecution authorities.
Excellent. And just to clarify there, but then when you say we are trying, that's when you're talking about the Blockchain Investigators Professional Association. That's you're trying to bring that together, and we'll look at that in a short while. But excellent. And what you've done there, you've shone a light on certain in various conversations that I have in classes when people talk about blockchain is there is this, as you say, this stubborn myth that actually it's complete. It gives everybody anonymity, and yes, probably when it first started, it did give that anonymity, but we're a lot further down the path. And you were talking about public blockchain. Are you able to just give us a little, just a little insight as to what other variants of blockchain there are?
So there are a lot of opportunities to be explored. What I mentioned earlier, to answer your question about we as a professional association. So the initiative actually was as a result of having professionals being trained by these companies on different use of these tools. So at the moment, we actually have users of these tools. We don't have professionals. Because if we think about compliance professionals, we have ethics and governance, we have training curriculum agreed, we have a set of skills required to do this kind of work. There are some technical standards, including for compliance tools. So you're able to choose whatever tool, but there is a minimum standard. For these companies providing blockchain analytics tools, there is no minimum standard. There is a quest for profit, and the plan is to professionalize such a job because it has become so important that it cannot rely only on, let's say, a tool training. So we have to become professionals to raise the bar in terms of standards, to be preoccupied to make sure that we do our job better, and of course that we have a common layer of training so that no matter if you've been trained by a company or myself by another company, when we actually meet and discuss about the case or we share information, there is an exchange of data, we actually speak the same language because the reality now is that I use some words and you use some others, and we try to come up with a solution, but we don't understand the problem. That's the challenge now.
Super interesting because effectively what you're describing in regards to, you say, users rather than professionals, that was effectively what the compliance world was like 30, 40 years ago, wasn't it? It was a case of it was each whether it was a financial sector dealt with their own their tackling financial crime in their own way. There was no set rules, and then the likes of FATF and OECD, we now got those rules. So what BPIA are trying to do, standardize those rules and get some standard in place. What are the implications? Are you seeing any fallout where because we haven't got that standardization, what are you seeing as implications to the industry?
So I would say that the first potential positive outcome is fostering innovation, because right now we have only a small number of players who are dominant in the market, providing excellent output in terms of results, but the methodology is not clear. So when you're actually trying to do your own work, whether you're a compliance officer in a financial institution or you're an investigator for a prosecution authority,
Mhm.
you could end up with good results, but these sometimes do not resist to scrutiny, and that
Yeah.
could be for an investigator in court or for a compliance officer, if your supervisor actually challenges why you've decided one way or another. Because let's say that all these providers provide for a compliance officer a risk score, and if a company provides a lower risk score and the other one could provide much higher risk score, you have to justify why you've decided one way or another. And if you're not able to explain that, you could face some challenging issues. And that's the problem now. So I think the priority has to be to engage with all these providers because we only act as a connector. Just like the ICA is the connector, we are also trying to be the connector. This is not a problem which could actually be solved by any one of us. Even we could be the smartest people around the world. This has to be built by consensus. This is not something that we simply agree this has to be done. No, it has to be built gradually with consensus so that people understand the problem and we also agree that something has to be done. And of course, nothing or nobody could actually challenge the necessity to have ethics and governance in place or a common field for training. And I think the ICA could actually be a leader to make sure that compliance professionals actually get the relevant training to understand much better the implications for the financial sector.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the ICA promotion there. But the you're speaking a real clear area in regards to you could have a really good investigation, whether you're law enforcement or whether you're a compliance professional. But you pointed out that clear aspect. Once it comes to be whether you're looking to offboard somebody, and then that individual then may challenge how you've got that information to support offboarding or maybe to stop a transaction. If you haven't got those rules and processes in place, your investigation will crumble around your ears. So real vital important points, certainly for compliance professionals, but also for law enforcement. I mean, an old adage in law enforcement is if it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. Well, if you can't explain how you've come to this conclusion or how you've come to this process, you're in a difficult situation. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that one, Bogdan. So we're talking about investigations, and I'm sure people have got ideas of how a blockchain investigation, what it actually involves. Could you talk us through how an investigation happens, the tools, techniques, skills involved, and that brings takes us to a conclusion?
Yeah, well, let's say that a typical workflow could start with a simple trigger, and the trigger could be a suspicious transaction report,
Hmm.
a victim wallet from a, let's say, ransomware case,
Hmm.
an exchange, or a virtual asset service provider flagging a deposit, or simply a sanctioned address. And that
Yeah.
could be the trigger. From that single point, let's say the trigger, we are able to reconstruct upstream and downstream the activity. As I mentioned earlier, the cluster, so to build a cluster around a specific address. When I speak about the address, let's make a correlation with the bank account in the
Yeah.
traditional finance. So we have the blockchain address in the blockchain space, just like we have the bank account in the traditional finance. We
Hmm.
then examine counterparties, which could be another virtual asset service providers, some mixtures, allowing to mingle funds, some bridges from one blockchain to another, some other protocols with decentralized finance. And we then can actually produce what is called like a graph of the flows because we actually trace and assess risk of the transactions, not just like in the traditional finance when we're actually dealing with the customers. And then based on the assessment of the transactions, a risk score can be applied and the attribution can actually be done. I mentioned earlier about the commercial providers. There has been a lot of innovation in the space. So the invitation to have these companies joining the standards is quite useful now. They've done a lot, as I mentioned. They are powerful and they generate quality outputs. They offer graph visualization automated clustering, they do sanction screening. They also have implemented AI in their transaction monitoring. They conduct risk scoring against some of their known typologies. Even the methodology is not clear, and this is what we're trying to address to make these methodologies clearer.
Yeah.
Um, and there is also a key message to our audience. As I mentioned earlier, these tools and the use of these tools are not, in fact, a profession. It's just a soft, and we're trying to build that up in terms of reputation expertise, like a dedicated profession. And what actually means is that what comes for blockchain investigation today is just tool training, nothing more than that. It's just to click around in any of these vendors' interface. That is actually necessary, and it cannot be done without this. This is the reality. But 100%, this is not sufficient for the years to come and for all the challenges that we're actually facing at the moment. If it's about the skills, I would say that when you're actually trying to address these challenges and, let's say, investigate, you need to have at least initially some basic technical literacy. Just understand the basics of what a transaction actually is, what a smart contract actually does, what a bridge transaction looks like. So without this technical basic literacy, you could just be reading a dashboard and you're not actually following the transactions on chain. With this basic literacy, you could actually build on a second layer some investigative skills. Just like, let's think about the detective, the basic evidential discipline, he would be able to recognize and apply. Let's say that we are dealing about hypothesis building, assessing sometimes contradicting evidence. And of course, this is highly relevant, let's say, about the chain of custody for the data you
Yeah.
collect, as I mentioned earlier, because this is highly relevant so that you can actually explain every analytical step, maybe to some of your colleagues, to your manager, or let's say for your branch in another jurisdiction or with your regulator. And sometimes, why not reproduce the work? Because sometimes you could end up with the result and you don't know how you've started it. And so you have to explain that.
Yeah.
Um, and the reality is now that is that if you're using more than one commercial provider to give you a blockchain analysis output, you could end up with different results, and you're not able to verify between the tools and use again whatever is given by any of these. So you have two outputs, unable to verify between the tools and unable to use it in your own transaction monitoring tools. This is quite often, and this is a big challenge for compliance professionals. So by having these investigative skills, there is also necessary to have, of course, this is our focus, financial crime expertise. And I believe that ICA is in a good position to expand the knowledge, let's say, on typologies. Even we are actually speaking about virtual assets or digital currencies in general.
Mm.
Um, if we speak about the flow of funds, basically this is just numbers. Unless you actually know how AML actually looks like in terms of placement, layering, and integration, have a clear understanding about sanctions evasions and about the use of virtual assets, the patterns to use virtual assets for sanctions evasion, or something that actually could look like basic wallet behavior. That could actually be relevant to understand just basic transactions. I mentioned also earlier about the implications from an ethical and governance perspective.
Hmm.
This is quite challenging, especially if we are dealing with law enforcement. Sometimes compliance departments and financial institutions receive requests for information from law enforcement, and it's quite relevant to make sure that the information provided as a response to these formal requests are well done because the information provided can actually freeze accounts and send people to prison. So
Yeah.
this is not a job that can be done, let's say, like a tick box. This is what I remember from my ICA diploma courses. Never tick box. Just make sure you address the challenge and you find the best solution to the best outcome. So that's why the focus on standards, it's highly relevant now because it could have great consequences, positive consequences for the outcome. And I would just conclude that a real investigation is when the analyst can actually show how he has conducted the work, can actually defend it. Why not under cross-examination? And of course, if it's possible, that actually depends on the context, have a peer or a colleague um to reach the same conclusion from the same basic information or evidence. So basically, that would be the overall explanation and the skills required to make sure that we can actually address and build expertise around these challenges.
Excellent. I mean, it's I've got a fairly good understanding of blockchain, but you were talking about some words there. You're talking about mixers and bridges. That'll be an area that some people may have never heard before, or may have heard but don't really understand it. And you're right. If these people are compliance professionals and they're producing information that's maybe, as I said before, maybe lead to stopping a transaction or exiting a client, or you're passing that information to law enforcement, and you say the outcomes of that could be a criminal prosecution. If your investigation, you don't really understand what you've presented, straight away there's a flaw in that foundation. But I like your approach there, what you've just said about as an analyst, if or whether you're an analyst or whether you're an investigator in any form in regards to that. If you can ask yourself those questions, is if somebody was to speak to me now and say, can I explain what I've done, and can I justify my findings? If you've got that thought path as you approach your findings, you're in a really good setting before we get to these standards that you set. You're almost setting your own professional standards, aren't you? And even if we can encourage folks to do that, I'd say that's a good plus. Um, so we talked about exposing criminality, and you touched upon some of the financial crimes that that a blockchain investigation can hit when we're looking at money laundering and sanctions evasion and things like that. What would a positive outcome look like in today's world when you're carrying out? What would be good?
Basically, results. And let's just remember some of the recent examples. You mentioned earlier also about the mixers. This
Yeah.
has been quite a complex challenge. And there was a takedown of cryptomixer.io. This was actually quite known. It was a coordinated action by Swiss and German authorities with Europol support. And if I remember right, there was more than 1 billion euros in Bitcoin
Right.
that has actually passed through that mixer service in 10 years' time. And they also seized a lot of terabytes of data and crypto assets worth millions of euro. So what has actually allowed this to happen as a success? It's just investigative work, hard investigative work, international cooperation, because sometimes we are dealing with um, criminality globally. So it's not only happening in Germany or in
Mm,
Switzerland or the UK. And of course, enforcement to make sure that those who are able to enforce have the capacity and have the knowledge. You also mentioned earlier about ransomware. And there is also the challenge of child sexual abuse material.
yeah.
This is highly relevant also for the UK's National Crime Agency.
Mm.
who's actually pursuing this. There is also a recent Europol report underlining that crypto assets remain a dominant payment method, and this is the reality. However, because the topic is how could we actually investigate and what is the methodology and what tools do we, the same Europol report actually underlines that the blockchain analysis, blockchain intelligence is now the baseline evidence in these investigations. So this is the reality. It cannot be used, otherwise you will be missing important information for your investigation. Um,
Excellent. And I'm certainly going to go and research it. You wouldn't happen to know what that investigation was about the crypto mixer, would you? The name of the company? Because I think some of our viewers would want to go and find out that story as how that investigation between Germany and Switzerland. If you haven't got it, I'm sure somebody can find it for their own
I
sake.
remember the website. I don't remember the name of the company. So the website was cryptomixer.io.
.io. Excellent.
And I don't think it was
Congratulations.
actually a company because
Yeah.
usually criminals don't set up companies, they do it in a different manner. They could be
Yeah.
using some shell companies in different jurisdictions,
Yeah.
but there is a kind of a chain of companies.
Excellent. Looking ahead by then, what would as we know, this landscape never stands still. So looking ahead, some of the emerging challenges, such as privacy coins and decentralized finance, what would be your advice to some of our listeners or viewers today?
Uh, let's say that the hardest problem at the moment is that the center of gravity in crypto money laundering has actually moved. We discussed earlier about mixers. Mixers actually remain relevant, but the action, I would call it action in terms of criminal activity, being relevant for financial institutions and for compliance officer, has actually shifted to bridges, allowing to exchange value between blockchains and decentralized exchanges. These are not actually covered by the most important pieces of regulation, and
Mm.
supervisors sometimes are missing a lot of details with these DeFi exchanges. And there is also the challenge of smart contracts obfuscation. This is also highly relevant, and overall, let's say that even bridges allowed to exchange value from one blockchain to another, and they are legitimate technologies. Um,
How would a compliance professional today know whether they're dealing with a compliance proficient bridge mixer or not?
so basically, I'll just share my story in terms of addressing these challenges. So the first and the most important element is to make sure that in your transaction monitoring systems, you're able to have blockchain analytics data. So you're able to identify correlations between your customers and the virtual asset service providers.
Hmm.
Sometimes you could also have just nested services. That actually means an individual or a company who may be transactioning virtual assets, and you as a bank or as a financial institute, you are not aware of that because you don't have the right tools to identify it. So there are some of these commercial providers who are actually providing outputs to identify based on their data analysis. Some companies or some individuals knowing to transact in crypto assets, but are not listed or approved as virtual asset service providers. So first of all, have a way to ingest data from blockchain analytics providers. And this is what I've been trying to do in the past years, trying to come up with solutions on how to integrate such blockchain analysis tools in transaction monitoring. Because sometimes you could get the cheap option, but you wouldn't get the best results. So there has to be a balance, striking a balance between getting valuable analytics and valuable output. so that you can actually know what to do with that data. So that's why I mentioned initially, make sure that you're able to ingest in your transaction monitoring
Yeah.
system,
So
both the
effectively, what
undertaking.
you're saying is go for the best that you can get, because if you don't, you're going to have gaps, you're going to have vulnerabilities, and that's going to leave you exposed. But then we could continue this conversation for a lot longer, and hopefully one day we can have another revisit to this area, because it's an area that's going to definitely expand 100%. So let's. I'd like to thank you very much for your time, Bogdan. I'd like to thank all our viewers as well for taking their time. And please do tune into our next In Conversation, which will be advertised in a couple of months. And thank you very much for your time, and goodbye.
Thank you again. It was excellent. It was great to share the experience and the challenges with the audience. I'm privileged to be part of the conversation. Thank you again.